The Montana wilderness was supposed to be silent, the kind of silence that pressed against a man's chest and forced him to breathe slower, deeper, the kind that made memories surface whether he invited them or not. Ethan Walker welcomed that silence. As a former Navy SEAL and a single father, silence was the only place where the noise inside his head ever loosened its grip. His tent sat low beneath towering pines, a thin thread of smoke rising from a carefully banked fire, everything positioned with instinctive precision learned long before fatherhood softened the edges of his hands. The sun was sinking, bleeding orange through the trees, when Ethan noticed what didn't belong. Footprints, uneven, panicked, too shallow for boots meant for survival. He straightened slowly, senses sharpening, eyes tracking the broken twigs and crushed undergrowth that cut across his campsite like a scar. Then he heard voices, high, strained, unfamiliar, drifting through the trees, clashing violently with the rhythm of the wild. 3 figures emerged from the brush, stumbling, clothes too clean, faces drawn tight with fear and disbelief. They stopped when they saw him, relief and suspicion colliding in their eyes. One of them, tall and composed despite the dirt streaking her expensive jacket, took a step forward. "We're lost," she said, the words cracking in a way money could not repair. Ethan didn't answer right away. He studied them the way he'd been trained to assess threats in hostile territory, except these women weren't enemies. They were something far more fragile, vulnerable, unprepared. The second woman clutched a designer bag like it was a lifeline, knuckles white, eyes darting to the darkening forest as if it might swallow her whole. The third, younger than the others, looked on the verge of tears, mascara smudged, confidence stripped bare by the cold air creeping in with the night. Ethan's mind ran calculations automatically, daylight fading, temperature dropping, no visible gear, no map, no clue where they'd come from. Whatever had brought them here, it wasn't skill. It wasn't experience. It was a mistake, a dangerous one. And then recognition flickered, not from their faces, but from the weight of their presence, the subtle assurance they carried even while frightened. These weren't hikers. These were women used to being followed, protected, obeyed. Billionaires, he realized, the kind whose names moved markets and made headlines, now standing helpless in front of a man who cooked his meals over fire and measured safety and instinct instead of security teams. The irony wasn't lost on him. Ethan felt the old reflex rise, the pull to take command, to secure, to protect. But it collided with something newer, heavier. He wasn't on a mission anymore. He was a father who promised his daughter he'd always come home. The forest around them shifted as the wind picked up, branches creaking like a warning. The women waited, breath held, unaware that in this moment, stripped of wealth and status, their lives balanced on a choice Ethan Walker hadn't planned to make when he came to Montana to be alone. Ethan Walker finally spoke when the wind shifted and carried the smell of snow down from the ridge, a low, almost imperceptible change that told him the temperature would drop hard within the hour. And when he did, his voice was calm, steady, the kind of voice people listen to without realizing why. He told them to step closer to the fire, to sit, to breathe, and though none of the 3 women were used to taking instructions from a stranger in worn boots and a faded jacket, they obeyed because the forest around them was already making it clear that it did not care who they were. He introduced himself simply as Ethan, no rank, no history, no explanation, and asked their names while he handed them water from his canteen, watching carefully to make sure they drank slowly, properly, like people who had been pushed past their limits without knowing it. The woman who had spoken first said her name was Victoria Hale, and there was something clipped and precise in the way she said it, as if she expected recognition, perhaps even authority, to follow. The second woman was Margaret Collins, older, composed in posture if not in eyes, her hands trembling despite her efforts to hide it. The youngest was Elena Brooks, who barely managed to speak at all, nodding weakly as if words required energy she no longer had. Ethan listened, nodding once, then asked the questions that mattered: how long they'd been lost, what direction they thought they'd come from, whether anyone knew where they were. Their answers came tangled and incomplete, stitched together from fragments of panic and disbelief. A helicopter drop-off that morning. A guided hike meant to last 2 hours. A wrong turn. A guide who went ahead to check something and never came back. Phones with no signal, panic setting in faster than logic. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, but responsibility. The same weight he'd carried in deserts and jungles half a world away, except this time the stakes felt quieter and heavier all at once. He told them plainly that night was coming fast and they weren't walking anywhere safely in the dark, not in this terrain, not dressed the way they were, and the word safely seemed to land hard between them because for the first time it occurred to them that safety was not guaranteed. Victoria protested, instinctively, asking about emergency beacons, satellite calls, rescue timelines, and Ethan let her finish before answering that sometimes rescue took time, and sometimes it didn't come at all unless you stayed alive long enough to be found. The fire popped, sparks spiraling upward, and Elena flinched like the sound was a gunshot. Ethan noticed everything, the way Margaret's breathing grew shallow, the way Victoria's jaw clenched when control slipped from her grasp, the way Elena kept glancing at the tree line as if expecting it to move. He moved efficiently, adding wood, adjusting the tarp he'd rigged between trees, turning his solo campsite into something that could shelter four without a word wasted. He handed out spare thermal layers, watched them struggle awkwardly into clothing meant for function instead of fashion, and for the first time the differences between their worlds were painfully visible. They didn't know how to warm their hands properly, didn't know why sitting directly on the ground stole heat faster than air, didn't know that fear burned calories faster than hunger. Ethan showed them anyway, quietly, patiently, not like a hero, not like a savior, but like a man who had learned long ago that knowledge only mattered if it was shared. As darkness settled in, the forest seemed to close around them, sounds sharpening instead of fading, every crack and rustle magnified. And it was then that Margaret finally broke, her voice shaking as she asked him what would have happened if they hadn't found him. Ethan didn't lie. He told her they would have been in serious trouble by morning, and the truth of it rippled through them like cold water. Victoria looked away, staring into the fire, and for the first time the mask of certainty slipped, revealing exhaustion etched deep beneath it. Elena began to cry, quietly at first, then harder, the sound raw and uncontained, and something in Ethan shifted as he remembered his daughter crying the same way after a nightmare, the way fear stripped people down to something smaller and more honest. He crouched near Elena, grounding his voice, telling her to focus on the warmth, on the fire, on the fact that right now she was alive and that was enough. She nodded, clinging to those words like a rope. Time stretched, measured not in minutes but in breaths and heartbeats, and eventually the women began to talk, not because Ethan asked, but because silence felt heavier than speech. Victoria spoke of boardrooms and billion-dollar decisions, of always being the one with the answers, and admitted in a low voice that she had never felt so powerless in her life. Margaret spoke of decades spent building an empire that left no room for weakness, confessing that the thought of dying out here without anyone knowing terrified her more than any financial collapse ever had. Elena admitted she'd agreed to the trip because she didn't know how to say no anymore, because everyone expected her to be fearless, adventurous, untouchable, and she'd believed them until the forest proved otherwise. Ethan listened, eyes scanning the dark, senses alert, but something inside him softened as he realized how little separated them in this moment, stripped of titles and protection, bound by cold and uncertainty. When they asked about him, about why he was out here alone, he hesitated, then told them he needed quiet, that the world felt too loud sometimes, and that the mountains helped him remember how to breathe. He didn't mention the SEAL teams, the deployments, the things he couldn't unsee, or the nights he woke up convinced he was back in another life. But the way he spoke carried enough weight that they understood there was more beneath the surface. The night deepened, stars burning through the sky with a clarity none of them had ever seen. And despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, something unexpected settled over the camp. A fragile sense of connection forged not by choice but by circumstance. Yet even as their breathing steadied and the fire held, Ethan's mind remained sharp, mapping routes, calculating distances, listening for sounds that didn't belong because he knew this was only the beginning. Somewhere out there, a guide was missing, weather was shifting, and the wilderness was indifferent to wealth and intention alike. And as Ethan stared into the dark beyond the firelight, he understood that by morning, every one of them would be changed, whether they survived or not. Morning came without mercy. Ethan sensed it before he saw it, the subtle shift in air pressure, the way the forest seemed to hold its breath. And when he opened his eyes, the sky above the treetops was a dull steel gray, heavy with the promise of snow. The fire had burned down to embers, but the women were still asleep, curled awkwardly in borrowed layers, faces drawn tight even in rest. And for a moment Ethan watched them the way he used to watch new recruits before Dantan, knowing the day ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. He rose quietly, checking the perimeter, reading the ground like a language he'd never forgotten, noting the direction of the wind, the faint tracks that told him something large had passed through during the night without coming too close. When he returned, Victoria was already awake, sitting stiffly with her back against a tree, eyes fixed on the gray sky as if she could will it to clear. She asked what the weather meant, and Ethan told her the truth, that snow would make visibility worse, slow movement and erase tracks, but it would also bring water and dampen scent, which mattered if they had to worry about animals. The word animals seemed to register differently now than it had the night before. Margaret joined them next, rubbing her hands together, pride warring with fear as she asked what the plan was, and Ethan noticed how naturally they deferred to him now, how quickly power shifted when money stopped working. He told them they would move at first light, heading toward lower ground where rescue was more likely and where the terrain would be less punishing, but only after they ate something, because fear without fuel was a liability. Elena struggled the most, her steps tentative, her breathing shallow, and when she admitted she felt dizzy, Ethan recognized the signs of exhaustion and dehydration and slowed everything down, forcing patience into a situation that demanded urgency, because survival was never about speed alone. As they packed, Victoria asked about the missing guide, whether Ethan thought he was alive, and he paused just long enough for the answer to hurt, saying that in the wilderness hope was a tool, not a guarantee, and you carried it carefully. They moved out in single file, Ethan in front, senses sharp, adjusting their pace to the weakest among them without ever making it feel like pity, teaching them how to place their feet, how to use their breath, how to listen for the difference between fear and instinct. Snow began to fall within the hour, light at first, almost gentle, flakes catching in Elena's hair like stars. But the forest changed with it, edges blurring, distances shrinking, and the silence growing deeper and more oppressive. Margaret slipped once on a wet rock and went down hard, the sound of her breath leaving her body sharp and panicked. And for a terrifying second, Ethan thought she'd broken something vital, but she hadn't. And as he helped her up, she laughed. A short, shaky sound that surprised all of them, including herself, because it felt like release. They walked for hours, muscles burning, conversations fading into the rhythm of movement, until a low rumble rolled through the valley, distant but unmistakable, and Ethan froze, raising a hand, his body going still in a way that pulled the others into silence instantly. He listened, eyes scanning, heart steady, and when the sound came again, he recognized it for what it was, not thunder but something heavier, closer, and alive. He told them to move slowly, to stay close, and not to run unless he said so, because panic was louder than any sound they could make on purpose. When the shape emerged through the trees, a large, dark mass moving with deliberate confidence, Elena gasped before she could stop herself, and Ethan felt the shift immediately, the animal's attention snapping toward them like a drawn bow. It was a bear, not charging, not retreating, simply assessing. And in that moment the women saw Ethan change. Not dramatically, not violently, but completely. His posture settling into something ancient and precise, his voice low and even as he told them to stand their ground, to make themselves look larger, to trust him. The bear huffed, snow dusting its fur, eyes unreadable, and time stretched thin as wire until finally it turned and moved away, melting back into the forest with the same indifference it had arrived with. Elena collapsed against a tree, sobbing openly now, Victoria's hands shaking as she realized how close they had come to disaster, and Margaret stared after the animal, awe and terror mingling on her face as she whispered that no amount of money could have prepared her for that. Ethan waited until their breathing slowed before moving again, because fear had a way of lingering. And when they walked on, something fundamental had shifted. Victoria asked him then, quietly, what he had done before this, before Montana, before the fire and the calm voice, and he considered lying, the way he always did, but something about the rawness of the moment stripped that impulse away. He told them he'd served in the Navy, that he'd been trained to survive when everything went wrong, and though he didn't say the word SEAL, they heard it anyway in the way he spoke, in the way he carried himself, and the respect in their eyes changed shape, deepening into something closer to reverence. As the day wore on, exhaustion gnawed at them, but so did a strange clarity, conversations drifting toward truths they had never voiced before. Victoria admitting she'd built her life on control because chaos terrified her. Margaret confessing she had children who barely spoke to her anymore. Elena admitting she didn't know who she was without the expectations of others pressing in from every side. Ethan shared more too, telling them about his daughter Lily, about the promise he'd made to always come back, about the fear that one day she'd see him as distant and unreachable the way he'd seen his own father. The snow thickened, and just as hope threatened to fray, Ethan spotted something unnatural through the trees, a line too straight, a shape that didn't belong, and his pulse quickened as he led them toward it, revealing the edge of a clearing, and beyond it, the faint outline of a service road, half buried but unmistakable. Relief hit them like a wave, Elena laughing and crying at once, Margaret sinking to her knees, Victoria closing her eyes as if in prayer. But Ethan didn't let them rush forward, scanning first, listening, because safety was never assumed, only confirmed. As they stepped onto the road, the world felt suddenly larger and smaller all at once, the wilderness receding, but not releasing its grip entirely. And in that moment, as the snow continued to fall and their breath rose in white clouds, all four of them understood that what they had shared out there could never be fully explained, only carried, and that whatever came next would be shaped forever by the fact that in the place where money meant nothing and fear meant everything, they had survived together. The road did not bring instant salvation, and Ethan knew that before the women dared to believe otherwise, because wilderness had a way of offering false promises to those who rushed toward hope without caution. He followed the road's curve in both directions, reading the way snow gathered unevenly along the edges, noting the absence of fresh tire tracks, the silence that pressed in heavier than before. And when he turned back to them, he saw the fragile relief on their faces beginning to crack. He told them the truth gently, that service roads like this were often abandoned for seasons at a time, sometimes longer, and that while it improved their odds, it did not end the danger. Victoria absorbed that information with a tight nod. Margaret exhaled slowly as if recalibrating her expectations, and Elena hugged herself, eyes scanning the gray distance as though willing a vehicle to appear. They followed the road anyway, because movement meant purpose, and purpose kept panic from taking root. Snow thickened as the hours dragged on, clinging to branches, muting sound, reshaping the world into something both beautiful and unforgiving. And Ethan adjusted their pace again, forcing frequent stops, checking circulation in numb fingers, reminding them to drink even when thirst disappeared, because dehydration hid behind cold more effectively than heat ever could. At one stop, Margaret's leg buckled again, pain flashing across her face, and this time she didn't try to hide it, admitting she couldn't keep going at the same pace. And Ethan made the decision, without hesitation, to redistribute weight, taking her pack, ignoring Victoria's protest until she realized he wasn't asking permission. That quiet authority, born of necessity rather than ego, continued to reshape the dynamic between them. And somewhere along the road, Elena asked him if he was ever afraid out here alone. And he surprised himself by answering honestly, saying, fear never left, it only changed shape, and learning to walk with it mattered more than trying to outrun it. The road dipped into a shallow valley where the snow lay deeper, and it was there they found the first sign that someone else had passed through recently. A broken reflector post snapped clean in half, its base scarred by impact, and Ethan's pulse quickened as he followed the trail of disturbance off the road and into the trees. What they found made Elena gasp and Victoria curse under her breath. The wreckage of a small utility vehicle, half buried, its windshield shattered, one door hanging open like a wound. Inside, they found signs of life but no person, an emergency kit torn open, a radio smashed beyond use, footprints leading away unevenly toward the slope above. The missing guide, Ethan realized, or someone like him. He felt the weight of the choice settle in his chest immediately, the familiar calculation between risk and responsibility. And when he turned back to the women, he saw the question already forming in their eyes. Margaret asked if the person could still be alive, her voice quiet but urgent, and Ethan answered that survival depended on time, injury, and luck, and that none of those could be ignored. Victoria argued that following an injured stranger deeper into worsening conditions was reckless, her words sharp but rooted in fear rather than arrogance, and Elena looked between them, torn, whispering that they couldn't just leave someone to die. Ethan closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, thinking of Lily, of the promise he carried like a compass, and then he made the call, because some decisions defined who you were long after the danger passed. He told them they would follow the trail for a short distance, assess, and turn back if it became too dangerous, and the relief mixed with fear that crossed Elena's face told him he'd chosen the harder but truer path. The climb was brutal, snow giving way beneath their feet, wind cutting sharper with elevation, and more than once Ethan caught Margaret just in time, his grip firm and grounding, reminding her that falling was not an option. They found the guide near the ridge, slumped against a tree, unconscious but breathing. His leg twisted at an angle that made Elena look away, and in that moment all hesitation vanished. Ethan moved with controlled urgency, checking vitals, stabilizing the injury as best he could with limited supplies, issuing instructions that Victoria and Margaret followed without question now, hands steady despite their fear. The guide stirred, groaning, and the sound felt like a small miracle, fragile and precious, and as snow continued to fall around them, Ethan realized they had crossed into a new phase of danger, because getting found was one thing, getting everyone out alive was another. He constructed a makeshift sled from branches and cord, ignoring the ache in his own body because pain was secondary to purpose, and together they began the slow descent back toward the road. Progress measured in feet rather than miles. The storm intensified, visibility shrinking, the world reduced to breath, effort, and trust. And at one point Victoria slipped, nearly taking Elena with her, and it was Margaret who caught them both, her strength surprising even herself as she laughed breathlessly, the sound tinged with hysteria and triumph. Hours blurred, muscles screamed, and when they finally reached the road again, dusk was bleeding into night, the sky darkening faster than any of them liked. Ethan knew they could not keep moving much longer, not with an injured man and exhaustion carving away at their edges. And when he spotted the outline of an old ranger cabin set back from the road, nearly swallowed by snow and time, he felt a rare flicker of something close to hope. The cabin was locked but intact, and when Ethan forced the door, the smell of old wood and dust felt like sanctuary. Inside they found a stove, dry kindling, and the remnants of long-abandoned supplies, and as the fire crackled to life, warmth flooding the small space, the women sagged with relief that bordered on disbelief. The guide was stable for now, breathing easier, and as they huddled around the fire, steam rising from damp clothes, something profound settled over them. Victoria stared into the flames, voice low, admitting she had spent her life believing preparation meant control, and now she understood it meant adaptability. Margaret confessed she had never trusted anyone to carry her weight before, and the realization felt both terrifying and freeing. Elena looked at Ethan with quiet intensity and said she didn't think she would ever be the same again, that the world felt sharper, more real, and Ethan nodded, because he knew that feeling well. Outside, the storm raged on, indifferent and relentless. But inside the cabin, amid exhaustion and shared silence, a fragile bond had formed, forged by fear, choice, and survival. And Ethan understood that whatever waited beyond that door, rescue, return, consequence, none of them would step back into their old lives unchanged, because the wilderness had stripped them down to something essential, and in doing so, had revealed truths none of them could ignore anymore. Night pressed hard against the walls of the ranger cabin, the storm outside howling like something alive, and inside the small wooden space, every sound felt amplified. The pop of the fire, the uneven breathing of the injured guide, the soft shifts of bodies trying to find rest without comfort. Ethan stayed awake long after the others drifted into shallow sleep, his back against the wall, eyes half-lidded but alert, listening to the rhythm of the wind and the deeper rhythm of his own thoughts. He had learned long ago that quiet moments were the most dangerous, because that was when memory crept in uninvited. But tonight the memories were tangled with something new. Faces around a fire, fear shared instead of carried alone, responsibility chosen rather than assigned. At some point in the early hours, Victoria stirred, rising quietly to sit near him, her movements careful, respectful, and for a while neither of them spoke. She finally broke the silence by asking if he ever regretted leaving the life that had made him this way, and the question hung between them, heavier than the storm. Ethan considered the answer with the same seriousness he'd once given mission briefings, then told her that regret implied a choice without consequence, and that every choice he'd made had shaped the man his daughter saw when she looked at him. Victoria nodded, eyes reflecting firelight, and admitted that for the first time she wondered who she might have been if she'd made choices for reasons other than survival disguised as ambition. When dawn came, muted and pale, the storm had softened into a steady fall, and the world outside the cabin looked hushed, almost reverent, as if the wilderness itself were catching its breath. Ethan roused the others gently, checking the guide first, relieved to find his breathing steady and his fever down just enough to be hopeful. Margaret moved stiffly, pain etched into her face, but she waved off concern with a quiet determination that felt earned rather than forced, and Elena stood at the small window, watching snow drift past, her expression distant and thoughtful. They ate what little they had left, sharing without discussion, and when they stepped outside, the cold felt different now, not shocking, but clarifying. Time stretched again as they waited, the road silent, the storm thinning, and just when doubt began to creep back in, the distant thrum of engines cut through the air, faint at first, then unmistakable. Elena was the first to hear it, her sharp intake of breath breaking the stillness. And moments later the sound resolved into movement, vehicles pushing through snow, rescue teams emerging from the gray like something unreal. Relief hit in waves, messy and overwhelming. Margaret sinking against Victoria, tears freezing on her lashes, Elena laughing through sobs as she pressed her hands to her face. Ethan stood back, watching, his body finally allowing itself to loosen, the long-held tension releasing in a quiet, almost painful way. The rescue teams moved quickly, efficiently, radios crackling, stretchers unfolding, and as the guide was carefully loaded and taken away, one of the rescuers clapped Ethan on the shoulder, recognition flickering in his eyes, not of fame, but of shared understanding. Helicopters arrived soon after, blades cutting through the air, and the contrast between the raw silence of the wilderness and the mechanical urgency of rescue felt jarring, almost intrusive. As they were ushered toward warmth and safety, the women paused, each in her own way reluctant to leave the cabin behind, as if stepping away meant severing something fragile and rare. Victoria turned to Ethan, her voice steady but her eyes unguarded, and thanked him, not with the polished gratitude of boardrooms and cameras, but with something simpler and deeper, acknowledging not just the actions but the choices behind them. Margaret took his hands, squeezing them with surprising strength, telling him he'd given her more than survival, that he'd reminded her what it felt like to trust without leverage. Elena hugged him without warning, arms tight, whispering that she didn't know how to carry this back into her life, and Ethan told her quietly that she didn't have to know yet, only that she shouldn't forget. The helicopters lifted off, carrying them away from the cabin, from the road, from the place where their worlds had collided, and as the wilderness fell away beneath them, Ethan felt a strange mix of relief and loss, like waking from a dream that had mattered too much to dismiss. Days later, back in Montana's quieter edges, Ethan returned to his normal rhythms, packing up his campsite, erasing the signs of his presence with care. But the silence no longer felt the same. At home, Lily ran into his arms with fierce joy, her laughter grounding him more completely than anything else ever had. And as he held her, breathing in the familiar scent of soap and safety, he understood that the wilderness had not taken him away from his life. It had given him back to it. News headlines followed, as they always did, speculation and stories swirling around the disappearance and rescue of 3 powerful women, but Ethan's name appeared only briefly, then faded, and he was grateful for that. What lingered instead were letters, handwritten and unpolished, arriving weeks later, each carrying a piece of what had been left unsaid. Victoria wrote of stepping back, of delegating, of learning to trust systems instead of controlling them, and thanked him for showing her what leadership looked like when stripped of fear. Margaret wrote of reconciling with her children, of awkward conversations and slow rebuilding, crediting a night in a cabin for reminding her that strength meant letting others carry you sometimes. Elena wrote last, her letter longer, uncertain, filled with questions rather than answers, but threaded through it all was a sense of awakening, a promise to choose her own path even when it felt terrifying. Ethan read the letters by the window as snow melted outside, the mountains shedding their white in quiet cycles, and when he finished, he folded them carefully and placed them away, not as trophies, but as reminders. He didn't know if their paths would cross again, and he didn't need them to, because what they had shared belonged to a time and place that could never be replicated. What mattered was that in the vast, indifferent wilderness, 4 people had been forced to see one another without armor, and in doing so, had found something rare and enduring. As spring edged closer and the world softened, Ethan took Lily hiking on gentler trails, teaching her how to listen to the forest, how to respect it, how to trust herself. And as she laughed and ran ahead, fearless and alive, he felt a quiet certainty settle in his chest. Survival, he realized, wasn't just about making it out alive. It was about carrying what you learned back into the world and letting it change the way you lived. The wilderness did not follow them back into their lives, but it stayed with them all the same, lingering in small, quiet ways that surfaced when the world grew too loud. For Ethan Walker, that truth revealed itself in the simplest moments. Standing in his kitchen at dawn, packing his daughter's lunch, pausing as sunlight cut across the counter the way it once filtered through the pines in Montana. He found himself breathing more deliberately now, listening more carefully, carrying a calm that no longer came from vigilance alone but from understanding. He no longer felt this need to escape into the wild to remember who he was, because the wilderness had already given him what he'd been searching for. permission to be present, to be human, to choose connection without fear of losing himself. Lily noticed the change first, of course, the way children always did, remarking one evening that her father smiled more, that his eyes looked less tired. And Ethan realized then that survival wasn't only about enduring danger, it was about returning with something gentle enough to share. For Victoria, Margaret, and Elena, the experience became a quiet dividing line in their lives, a before and an after that no amount of success could blur. They moved through boardrooms and galas with the same confidence the world expected, but beneath it lived a deeper awareness, a knowledge that control was an illusion and that strength revealed itself most clearly when it was shared. None of them spoke publicly about the nights in the storm or the cabin buried in snow, but in private moments, when fear crept in or choices grew heavy, they remembered a fire crackling in the dark and a man who had shown them that leadership could be calm, that courage could be quiet, that survival sometimes meant surrendering who you thought you were. They never tried to repay Ethan in ways that could be measured, because what he had given them couldn't be bought or returned. It could only be honored by living differently. Seasons passed, headlines faded, and the world moved on, but the mountains remained, patient and unchanged, holding the echoes of footsteps that had once crossed in desperation and left in understanding. And somewhere in that vastness, the truth endured. When stripped of wealth, power, and expectation, people were revealed not by what they owned, but by how they chose to care for one another. The wilderness had tested them, humbled them, and ultimately bound them together in a way that required no promises and no permanence. It had simply shown them who they were when everything else fell away. And in that revelation, they found something rarer than safety or success. They found perspective.